Hello, and welcome to the Girlfriend God Podcast, a podcast in search of and in service to the divine feminine, bringing you an equal mix of academic research and emotional, spiritual experience. If you enjoy the Girlfriend God, please share it, rate it, or leave a review. Let's get in the flow. Hello. Today,
Good morning.
I'm happy to have Janell Rhiannon in the hot seat. She's the creator and host of the Greek Mythology Retold podcast, and also the author of the Homeric Chronicles, a retelling of the Trojan War era, which you can purchase at
Amazon.
Amazon.
I know. I work.
Or wherever you buy your books. The first three books are out, and she's currently working on the fourth. Janell has a master's degree in history. And in her research, she focused on, I thought this was very interesting, she focused on Alexander the Great and his use of clothing as a political means to control his overreaching empire. She believes that history really is storytelling, and that's what fuels her curiosity about the past for her writing and research. You can find Janell online at janellrhiannon.com or at Janell Rhiannon and Greek Mythology Retold on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Facebook. And today we're going to be talking about relationships and marriages and the women left behind during the Trojan War.
Yeah.
So, Janell, welcome. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. So I'm glad I found you on Instagram yourself. Got into, listening to what you were saying about all the goddesses and women. That really resonated. So I appreciate being on your show. Thank you.
Yeah. So you had sent me a list, which I promptly didn't have up on the screen. So let's go to your list and tell me about the things that you came prepared to talk about today.
Okay, yeah. I think on my list were Penelope, Clytemnestra, and Oenone. So everybody, when people think about the Trojan War, I don't know, one of the things that makes my series unique is that I have put the events in a chronological order.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me about a year to do that, because when the bards were singing about the Trojan War, the stories were coming from all various regions. It wasn't like the story was a central point and moved out. So the stories about the heroes primarily were told here and there, and some stories would come together. So there was never any sense of chronology, right, about when these characters were doing what, But you do have elements of somebody being a son or daughter of somebody. So one of the things that I did was try to think about, okay, like if an average span would be about, I just kind of looked at about 18 to 20 years of like have a baby, next generation, and then tried to put everything in sort of this chronology. And that, and I forget where I was going with that, was because it had something to do with the
it's
women.
interesting that you say that, because so much of mythology is like that, right? Like we have these scattered pieces from different civilizations in different time periods, and I think it's really only through archaeology and anthropology that we can really definitively put things in any kind of a timeline, right?
Right.
But I get what you're saying, that in these songs of the bards, there are clues, right?
Yes.
There are clues as to when that was and where how that interpretation came about.
Right. And we pretty much, I mean, archaeology is now, pretty certain they know where the ancient city of Troy was. And I think it's level Troy 6 or Troy 7. And the idea that the Trojan War was just a myth is no longer a myth. Like it's pretty much like that was a war. It happened. Yeah. One of my favorite books is this one by Barry Strauss, and he talks about how in the oral tradition, the one thing that would have stuck even if the stories were a little bit different, and thinking about when stories, this is before stories were written down, right? So
Right.
the one thing that would have remained the same, the easiest thing for bards to remember would be names. So these were probably actual people or amalgamations of or embellishments on, say, actual individuals who fought in the
Right.
war. And I guess where I was going with the chronology was that most people think of the movie Troy. They land on the beach, maybe a month later, there's this great siege of the city. It didn't really happen like that.
Right.
It was
It took place over
almost,
several years, right?
yeah, it was almost a decade. So the Iliad opens up like in the ninth year, and it's catalogs the last 40 or so days uh before Troy's going to fall, like that time period. And um in that 10-year gap, for me, when I'm putting the time, like, well, what's happening? What's going on? And so
Right.
that sort of lays that allows to lay down a foundation of what's going on with the families, the women, and who's um uh you know how are all of these families that we know that have their own stories that eventually bleed into the Trojan War. So I do use the archaeological date as sort of a pinpoint, and I built the timeline before and after. And so I use a lot of sources for that.
Why the
I
Trojan War? Why, of all the things in mythology, why the Trojan War?
I've here, it's a kind of a long story. Here we go. So when I was in graduate school, I became fascinated with Alexander the Great. I started studying ancient Rome under Dr. Diane Harris, who was a mentor of mine. And she now teaches, I believe, in Chicago somewhere. She and her husband are both archaeologists, and she was just very fascinating. So she kind of turned me on to the ancient world in my undergrad, and then that's what I pursued in my master's. And then I started studying um, Alexander the Great was what I chose, and then I also interested in textiles and clothing. And so I started taking some classes in historical costuming. And then that's kind of what branched into, I started merging these ideas. And when I was time to talk about my thesis, as I studied Alexander, I started noticing, that how his use of clothing became like this contention between him and the Macedonians. And so
Mhm.
I don't know, it just took off from there. And then one of the stories was that Alexander would sleep with and this was under Plutarch, I think, that Alexander would sleep with a copy of the Iliad underneath his pillow, and that he was sort of supposed to be emulating Achilles. I hadn't read the Iliad until then, and that
Right.
was 20 some years ago. And so I was like, what is this? What is this Iliad? I knew Achilles, right? But I
Right.
didn't
Right.
I hadn't I only knew what everybody else knew, like that you saw in a movie or you just sort of heard, his Achilles heel, he got shot in the, heel with the arrow or whatever. And so that led me to read the Iliad. And by that time I ended up with Dr. Harris she went back east to teach. And so my next mentor who had to take over the middle of my thesis project was Dr. Victor Davis Hanson. And he was very deep into the Iliad and the Odyssey. And he said, as you get older, he said, basically you're an Iliad person or an Odyssey person. And and
Like you can't be a Giants fan and a Jets fan.
you're right, like that. And so now and at first I was very much an Odyssey person because I felt like that was an easier story to digest. It seemed more fantastical, right? And then I became more enamored with and curious about the Iliad. And I mean, I've gone back and forth now my whole life, and I've read several translations. And my favorites that I have used so far are um, This one I used the Iliad by Caroline Alexander. I love her translation. That's my favorite. I've read all the other ones. They're all men. And
Of
then this
course.
one is right. And then I've got the Emily Wilson's The Odyssey, which I love her translation of that too. And I've also read different translations, but um, those two women's I use those as a backbone. I try to always use women translators just because I think as it gives us a different perspective, and that
Right.
sometimes we choose, when you have a choice between how you can translate something from Greek. And I don't have Greek or Latin, just very rudimentary things that I would have to verify with my mentors, but I find that very intriguing, you know. So
Well, even like the bards, right? Whoever is telling the story, no matter how impartial they attempt to be, they're still human and they
right,
still have their own
right,
personal beliefs and right?
right. I find that the older I've got, that the more I see the Iliad and the Odyssey as really just telling the story about being human. And that I think that's what has continued to hold my fascination. That's why I want to tell these stories. I do tell them in a very really adult, spicy way. Some people don't appreciate that, but you know,
Those people have no sense of humor then,
they
right?
have they have no sense of humor, and there are writers that it's really difficult because I've had some people read them expecting a very feminist slant or view. I don't write them that way. And I try, as a writer, you try not to read all your reviews, but some people
Right.
really criticize that. And I'm like, I'm a woman, and you can't tell me how to be a woman.
Right, right.
You
Or
can't,
feminist.
like, yeah, you can't, and so I try to keep the spirit of the myths the way they are. I'm not really trying to uh rewrite it. And I guess this
Right.
goes
I
back
mean,
to the
the name of your
timeline, like,
podcast isn't
yeah,
Greek history rewritten. It's right.
right,
It's Greek
right,
history retold.
right. So
Which is all that, which is like, I mean, that's what historical fiction as a genre is, right?
right. Yeah, we can't, I mean, if my podcasts are much more academically inclined, so I
Mhm.
will include my sources, and that's where I draw my inspiration from. But when I'm telling the story, I'm not really trying to create a, a, yeah, I'm not trying to school you on ancient Greek culture. That's
Right,
not the goal.
right,
I'm telling the human story, right?
right.
And that kind of goes back to the timeline as I roll around with all these ideas. Like, well, what would motivate somebody for a period of time? Why
Mhm.
would they do that? How would they feel about that? And and in graduate school they call that, you can't psychoanalyze historical figures, but now I think we've moved away. I mean, that was over 20 years ago, so we've moved away from the idea that you can't, because as a human being certain things are going to affect you. So like my uh the Achilles that I write is kind of a jerk, not
Mhm.
because not because he's a man, but because he has PTSD.
Mm.
Like, how could he or any of those guys not be suffering from PTSD after
Right,
10
right.
years of killing, raping,
War.
pillaging, war,
Right,
living out of
right,
tents, living off their boats? Like, how could they not be traumatized in their psyche
right.
in some way? How would that manifest? So the Achilles I wrote starts drinking more and more till he's kind of a drunkard,
Mhm, mhm.
violent. And when the opening line is, of Achilles in the Iliad is, like, sing of the rage of Achilles. Well, that rage is part of, you know, he's losing his humanity,
Right.
and he loses it at the end. That's we're watching him unravel as a human being. So I take that same lens, and that's what I'm looking at the women with too. And so we see Briseis is mentioned in the Iliad, Andromache, Hecuba. That's it. And then we have the Circe, Calypso, and Penelope primarily in the Odyssey. Of course,
Right.
Athena, Aphrodite, back and forth in both. But the in the Iliad, the story of like what Penelope, Clytemnestra, and Oenone are going through. Oenone happens. A lot of people don't know who Oenone is, but I'll get to that one. But those are the three women I thought would be interesting to talk about. Penelope's story starts before the Iliad, because her husband, right, Odysseus, has to go to war. He gets called, and Clytemnestra, her daughter Iphigenia, is sacrificed, and so her husband can go off to war. And then Oenone is the wife of Paris, who it's his first wife, and she's a wood nymph, and he abandons her when he takes Helen and moves to the city of Troy. So I have like the two women who are left behind. Penelope is considered the virtuous woman, and Clytemnestra is the not virtuous woman. Both of them are. Both of them are. They're both basically they're left behind as queens, right? They have royal status. They have power in a world where most women didn't have power. And then there's Oenone, who is a nymph, right? So she's an immortal, but she has great emotional suffering, and she's like the forgotten wife. So she doesn't have she's outside of that sort of any kind of construct that the ancient world may have had for women, except
Right.
the fact that she gets left behind by a husband who chooses to go to Troy and goes to war. So that was that's what I wanted to talk about. So let's see, who should we talk about first?
Totally
Uh,
up to you.
okay, let's do Penelope. Are you familiar with the story of how
A,
Odysseus?
a little, but
Okay,
let's not assume that anyone listening
okay, all right.
is.
So
So,
Penelope is actually a cousin of Helen and Clytemnestra. So her father and their father were brothers. That's how they're connected. Odysseus wins Penelope's hand in a foot race after um, Odysseus helps King Tyndareus come up with the plan to make sure that Helen gets married off without his having to throw his kingdom into turmoil and war, because all the suitors had descended upon Sparta to marry Helen. So there's that story. And so that's when Odysseus meets Penelope at that gathering of suitors. And then Penelope and Odysseus get married and go back to Ithaca. They are there for not too long. They have Telemachus, and soon after that is when Helen she does marry Menelaus, and a little bit of time I would give it about a year or two as I put it in a timeline. A little bit of time has to pass because babies had to get conceived and then born. Helen leaves an infant to go off with Paris to Troy. There's a whole bunch of reasons why she would do that. I don't think she was kidnapped. I think she made a choice. And she was also under, I believe, the way I wrote it, a love spell by Aphrodite, because Aphrodite was fulfilling a promise that she made to Paris because she won the contest of who was the fairest. So there's a lot of things going into there are a lot of things in the background, I believe, that go feed into that story, but that's a whole other subject. So Penelope, Odysseus doesn't want to leave his young wife, his new son. he gets tricked into going because he took the oath, which was that he promised if anything happened to Helen that he would fight to win her, to help her husband get her back. So he has to go. He gets tricked into going. He's pissed off, doesn't want to go, but he leaves Penelope behind with the young son. Now, what people know about Penelope is that she's like the long suffering wife, that she basically waits 20 years for her husband to come back. So he's off to war, doing what men do when they're at war. And that made me think a lot about, as I'm a mom and a grandmother. So I think, what would that be like? Oh, when I grew up, my dad was in the military. So he was on nuclear submarines during the Vietnam War. So there was a lot of, I understood that the idea of waiting for my dad to come home all the time as a little kid. So you spend a lot of your time not with your father, but then when they would come back, there'd be the big party, right? And everybody would be very excited about the men returning. So I remember that feeling of, as a kid, seeing all the sailors come off of the submarine, and the anticipation and the joy and the tears. There's
Right.
something about that homecoming that, unless you have been in the military, you wouldn't, I don't know if you would understand that, because they would go away for, on this, back in that time, they didn't even have, there was no communication,
Right, right.
zero. Like, uh, it had to be a super big emergency that they could, I want to say like telegram. I'm not even sure how they would
Like
communicate with that,
send word
to the
back
government.
home.
Yeah, exactly. So they would just be gone for 9 months on it. You wouldn't know anything. So, I think, what would Penelope be doing with this baby? And then she had also Odysseus's mother lived there. I always found that interesting, that Odysseus's mother, Anticlea, she remained in the great hall, the palace, with Penelope, her daughter-in-law, but her husband, Laertes, who the former king of Ithaca, he was off on his own little plot of land doing agricultural stuff, like being basically a farmer. So I often wonder, like, why was that? Why were they split up? What was that about?
What happened there?
Yeah, what happened there? And then I did some more research, and then I found that there was a little story somewhere, and I don't know who the source was, but that Odysseus had, or excuse me, Laertes had brought a maid into the house, a woman into the household as sort of a second wife. This was she became the nursemaid to Odysseus, but that he never slept with her, which I thought, what? And that made me do a double take. Like, you brought another woman into the household as a second wife, and it was okay because you weren't going to have sex with her. And I was thinking, if I was the first wife, I don't know how I'd feel. That might piss me off a little bit.
Mhm.
Look, I don't know. So I try to think about, like would that have anything to do with why in their older age they kind of split up? Because they're not, the mom stays behind to help Penelope. She's already there. The dad's already gone by the time we hear anything about the story.
Right.
Obviously the dad's gone because Odysseus is already the king, but his dad's alive. So his dad just sort of stepped down and moved off to his own little farm, right? So what would Penelope be doing? She's just wasting away for 20 years, raising a son as a single mom, running the kingdom. She's in charge of a lot of stuff. She has a lot of power. She has a
Right.
lot of power. And I often think about, like, does she wait? Would she not have waited? So I gave her some, I I I kind of inserted some things that I think she would not have waited. I feel like, as a woman, after a period of time, you get tired of waiting. And then I think, just as a human being, don't you have urges? I mean,
Mhm.
But that's where I inserted some of my spicy stuff. Maybe people don't appreciate that. But I think that she's often seen as the virtuous one because she is seen to have waited, and she is written as a woman who's kind of weepy. Um, and you have to read between the lines to see any sort of strength that she would have, you
Well,
know?
and I think these women in mythology, right, like something we talk about on the show all the time is how the patriarchy sort of rewrote the story of a lot of these goddesses because they didn't want representations of strong, independent, sexual women.
Women, right? Yeah,
Um,
which is exactly
that's
what
why
Clytemnestra's.
those early Greek sculptures of these goddesses are not older women as some of them were. They're all young, virginal, perfect,
Mhm.
unspoiled, right?
Yes,
No
right,
power, because they're all like
right,
maiden age, right?
right,
So I think that, because like the music industry today is still very much dominated by men. I assume that
right,
in the land of bards, because there were no bardesses that I'm aware of, right? So
right,
all of that goes into these stories that we know. So it's not surprising to me that
right,
Penelope was painted as this, virginal, longing, devastated wife.
right.
But you're right.
And
I wasn't.
yeah. And so, and then I would think about, and I just made a post about an olive tree because, one of the things that the story of Odysseus and Penelope, they are, uh, like that is a heterosexual couple that have made that the mythology has sort of kept together at least for a long period of time. And she really was sort of a representation for Odysseus because he kept, even when he was on Calypso's island, it was the story was that he would go out and on the beach every day kind of looking at the horizon, and he would cry. And in the end, Calypso, even though he was being sexually satisfied and treated like a god, and when it came right down to it, when he was presented with immortality, she's like, "Stay with me and be my husband, and I'll make you immortal." And then in the end, he didn't want it. He rejected her, and he said, "Though you're beautiful and all these wonderful things," but he really wanted to get back to his home, his wife, and there's that longing for, I think, in a PTSD kind of way, right? That you want to go back to, you want the comfort of the things that you once had, and
Right,
hoping that you would find that comfort or maybe find that part of yourself that you lost during war. So Penelope was or at least the idea of her was a beacon for him to get home to. So again, she is seen as virtuous because she is right a beacon to get home to.
right.
And Agamemnon says the opposite stuff. Like when he has to give up Chryseis, he's like, "Well, I like her better than my old bitch at home," referring to Clytemnestra. Never
Right.
mind the fact that you freaking murdered their daughter, to get the winds to sail to Aulis. Like you're the asshole.
Right,
It's
right,
not is not her, but she's painted already as this bitch, and that he does not want to go home to. Which in stark contrast to Odysseus, always refers to Penelope in a favorable light. So
right,
you see that contrast is already there in all of the stories, and so from whatever bards were feeding into it, that's the stories about Penelope were virtuous ones, and the stories about Clytemnestra were sketchy, and that was
right.
and that that all came together in that way. So I think that for
What were you
Penelope,
what were you going to say about the olive tree? You started to say something about the olive
oh
tree.
yeah, sorry, that the olive tree, that an olive tree if is really hard to destroy. And the symbol for Odysseus and Penelope was the marriage bed, that he had carved one of the posts out of a living tree. So it wasn't the fact, and I didn't come to this until I actually owned olive trees. And the more you hack away at an olive tree, the more it wants to grow. And it keeps sprouting. You're like, God, I just pruned you, and so like little shoots will come off everywhere. And so to carve a bedpost out of a living tree, it must have been constantly sprouting. It must have constantly needed tending. So I see a lot of symbolism there, that a marriage bed or a marriage or a relationship, a sacredness of whatever this bond was, would need constant tending. And in his absence, Penelope would have to be tending that bedpost that must have kept sprouting, right? She would have to be tending that by herself.
I wanted to bring you back to that because my friend and occasional co-host, Dr. Carla Ionescu, who's in Greece right now, she made this post yesterday on Instagram because she set out on a mission to find this olive tree that's 2,800 years old.
Yes.
And yeah, it was pretty amazing. So when you said olive tree, I was like, well, that's ironic.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just made a post about an olive tree. And I wanted to I was gonna, I don't know, I think a podcast was like brewing in my head, but about that. So it says a lot about, Odysseus and Penelope. And that's why at the end of the Odyssey, when she says, when she's not quite sure, she's testing Odysseus to make sure that really is him, because it's been a long time. And of course, Athena made him look amazingly, bigger, stronger. I'm just imagining ripped and oiled, like just shiny,
right?
And all the things. And she's like, well, and he's like, God, you're a hard woman. Your heart is iron, like it's me. And she's like, well, I don't know. And he's like, fine. And she basically says, I'll have the maid move the bed out into the hallway. And then he gets mad, and that's when he loses his shit, because it's like, have you cut the tree? Because if you cut the post, right, from the where it's rooted in the ground, then it's going to die. That's no longer a living olive tree post, right? That would be tended. So that would mean, that would represent a cutting of that sacred bond in a lot of ways, not just that she did it, but that the tree would be dead. There'd be no more leaves on it. It would just be a piece of wood at that point. And then, obviously she's like, no, I'm just kidding, and only he's supposed to know about it because he built the bed. Right. So, in other words, how was Penelope then tending this tree to maintain the sacredness of her marriage? And I think that the one way she would have done that would be not to have slept with men, but with other women. So there are a lot of maids and females in the household.
Right.
And so that's how I wrote it. I think that when you would have any sort of need for comfort, physical, sexual comfort, that it would be easier to have a relationship or have intimacies with other women, because I don't think that in her, like, I'm thinking in Penelope's mind, she has to be tending this tree. It's almost like as Odysseus could be watching her, right? Certainly she knew the gods were watching her. Athena would often cause her to go into a deep sleep, and they called it her bed of sorrows. So she would cry, and missing Odysseus, and so she would just get into like a magical sleep, which I would equate to depression, maybe. Right? You get depressed and overwhelmed, and what do? Take a nap, right? Yeah. So, I kind of connected all those things. I think that would have been a way that she could still be virtuous, at least in her mind, even. And that if Odysseus knew that she had lain with other women, or if he were somehow to discover that would not be offensive. or as
I don't know.
offensive to
As
you.
a lesbian, I'm pretty sure that if she was sleeping with a bunch of women, eventually she would have fallen in love with one of them.
Yeah, I think that that was I was kind of going in that direction. And
Yeah,
so as
yeah,
I get into book four,
yeah.
I'm rolling in that direction because remember at the Odyssey that not only there's the one maid that betrays her to and that she has the ruse of weaving for 3 years, weaving the shroud for Laertes, and then she weaves during the day, and at night she goes and undoes it, and the one maid catches her doing it, and then tells the suitors, and then that sort of is when the all the shit hits the fan, and um, Odysseus does slaughter all the maids when he
Mm.
comes back. Not only does he kill all the suitors, but he also kills all the maids. He sees them as betraying his wife. But if he
Mhm.
has an inkling that maybe some of them have been sleeping with her, also, he might be more motivated.
It might
And
be more motivated to slaughter them. So,
yeah,
so who's next on your list?
Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra is the non-virtuous, right? So
Okay.
she's the woman who is seen. She basically has well, if I backtrack, so Clytemnestra's story begins before Agamemnon. She was actually married prior. I found so you dig into like the other sources and I dig all over the place. So she had another husband and a child prior to Agamemnon, and Agamemnon raided the city where she was from and killed her husband, who was the prince of the city, and her child. And I believe his name was Tantalus. And there's Tantalus 1, Tantalus 2, Tantalus 3. And it kind of reminded me of your podcast where you're talking about all the different Marys.
Right.
So names are the same, but it's like there's different stories, there's different men that are
Right.
being represented. So Agamemnon basically kills her first husband, kills her child, not unlike a lion would kill all of that takes over a pride's, as the main lion kills all the cubs because
Right.
they don't want any of not his kids running around. So
Right.
she's forced to marry Agamemnon under those circumstances, if you can imagine. Have to marry the man who kills your husband and your child. Like, ugh. So she's already she in my mind, like what would go through your mind as of what like that you would have to do that. And I'm sure that there have been women throughout history who have had to marry men who were abusive, who had raped them prior. I mean,
Right.
to just like what would how would you as a woman have to compartmentalize yourself,
Right.
the mental capacity of that, and that's your own PTSD, that's your own trauma that you've got to manage, and like what would that look like? And so I had her mother give her advice. Her mother is Leda, who'd been raped by Zeus not once but twice.
Right.
um she says to her, what you can control is in your world within the family. So that's what you focus on. And he can he might win this battle, but don't let him win the war. Like
Right.
women have to fight the war in a different way. And basically it was like use your sexuality, you know, lure him, like drag him around by his cock, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so Clytemnestra realizes that, and her mother tells her that the only power you have is in giving him children. Like, and then once you have children, then that's where your power lies. There you can start to exert your influence through that. So that's what Clytemnestra does, and that's all the children that we know. And so when Iphigenia is killed, that's then the second time that she's endured Agamemnon killing one of her children. But this time, a grown daughter who that she's had years of knowing, right? And um, not that killing her infant was better, but I mean, now you have a whole lifetime of memories and all the everything. And I think I think as a mom and as a woman, like inside of your brain, you would just be like, that's fucking it. Like boop, like all you could see would be red at that point. Like I
Right,
just want to
right,
kill this motherfucker. Like that's all I want to do now.
right,
And she's got like 9 years to stew on that.
right.
In the meantime, he's had to leave her as the queen, right? She's still the queen of Mycenae while he's off doing war.
Right.
So she's running a kingdom. She's, getting, power in her own being and stewing about this. She took up a lover, Agathis, who was Agamemnon's half brother. That's a whole other that's a whole other story. But um she's seen as not virtuous. And it's funny because Agamemnon, when he had to return Chryseis, which is the whole thing about between him and Achilles, well, if I have to give her up, like F you, I'm gonna take your woman, Achilles. And Achilles like, you son of a bitch, I'm not gonna fight for you anymore. So the guys are all fighting about women, and he was just like, well, I like her better than my cold-hearted bitch back home, Clytemnestra. None of you guys like her. But it's kind of like, yeah, she hates your guts too. Like you, like how it, and I think he has to. It's funny to me that's how he thinks of her. Like you killed their daughter. Like
Right, right.
that was your daughter too. Like that was your legitimate child that you were willing to sacrifice to get the right wins
Yeah,
to
but
get
all this mythology created by men and for men is never going to
right.
hold them accountable for their own behavior,
Yeah,
right? I mean, that's the
right.
setup from the beginning. And we see that
Exactly.
happen again and again and again in
Yeah,
mythology. That's why when people are like, well, the patriarchy started with the Christian church, I'm like, no.
did not. No, it
It
did
was
not.
already happening centuries before that. So,
Right. It's been and I think oh gosh, I watched something. I'm gonna go off track a little bit. I should keep notes. This is how my brain literally works. I
I
just start
understand.
going off.
Believe me, I understand.
I was listening to something that was talking about how that as we move towards in the modern world this idea of equality, that for women it just gets like worse because up until adolescence, girls are almost a little bit bigger until boys start to get more testosterone, and then but by the time you're full grown woman or full grown men and women, a full grown man is body strength, like physically they can dominate women, and that at a and at the same time that's also when women are having children and would theoretically like need more protection. So it's like as a woman you actually get less of a voice because if you're busy trying to be the mom and you're the one like you're breastfeeding babies, like you're and there was making that correlation, and for some reason that just stuck with me about how there is that thread of truth through that. And I think that would be true through all of society. So we're striving for like political in the modern world, right? Political equality, equality of pay, but physiologically and through history and even today, women are we are not as physically strong as men. And when men can wield their physical strength against women, that's what really makes us vulnerable. And if
Right.
you were living in a time of war, um, and living in a time where even if like 150 years ago, women living on the prairie, in the United States, or women living anywhere in a village in the Middle Ages, like you depended on the physical strength of men around you to do do things like I couldn't throw a bale of hay up and do that in the farm. Like I physically couldn't do a lot of the work that agriculture required. And I think that was the connection, that as we moved away from hunting, gathering kind of things, there's a lot of agricultural things that are harder for women to do because we don't have the same upper body strength. And so we kind of, that sort of led to women, to me, what I saw is how women were vulnerable. It made me see how women would be vulnerable physically, right? And so if the men around you were not virtuous, then your life was kind of fucked. And so Penelope, at least
Right.
Odysseus, right?
I was going to
Odysseus,
say, because even when the women were revered, like those early hunter-gatherer societies,
yeah,
and that's always a misnomer, right? Because we were all
right.
hunter-gatherers. We have
Yeah,
this
all of, yeah, right.
notion of, the women did the gathering and the cooking and all that, and the men did all the
Yeah,
hunting. That's not true. We all
yeah,
did
yeah,
everything.
right.
But because the women were revered, especially in these early like nomadic cultures when they started to come up with the concepts of, witches and wise women and healers and all of those things. Because the men were stronger, it was their job to protect the
Mm-hmm.
women,
Mm-hmm.
even though the women themselves were likely much more physically strong than we have given them credit for, right? Because if you
Right.
go back far enough in history and mythology, you have the original Amazonians, which I'm
Yeah.
fairly certain could do fucking anything that a man could
Right.
do,
Oh
right?
yeah. Yeah. Penthesilea, she was an equal match for Achilles.
Right.
They fought man to woman. Like that was,
Right. Right.
one on one. And,
But
and
I
and
think
in the ancient world, that's a big deal to
right,
fight.
right,
Like you only matched up the heroes to somebody else who was equal, you know.
right,
Um,
right,
so that was a big deal. But I see that in the day-to-day life of women, that, especially as we move toward agriculture, when you think about like farm life, there's a lot of things that women can do, and there's
right,
things that women physically can't. And I see that as like I'm remodeling a house by myself, and there are things that I physically cannot do. And I'm like, damn it,
right,
it's too
right,
heavy for me, or it's too big
right.
for me. I can't get it. But then I call my son, and he'll be like, oh, you mean this? And I'll be like, oh my God, okay. Yes, that. I need that. Help me. So I see
That
that.
happens in my house without men. My wife will be like, "Can you open this for me?"
Yeah. There are things. So
Right, right,
if the men in your life were on some sort of equal plane of what was considered virtuous, right? That, Odysseus is seen as sort of like the virtuous husband. He
right,
comes back and he kills all the suitors, and he makes sure that his wife is now in a safe place. Then we can go all kind of ways with that. But
right,
Agamemnon, and at least away from her, he's not talking smack about her, right? He wants to
right.
get back to her. But Agamemnon's like the whole other opposite. Like, you killed the daughter, you're talking smack about her. Like, you're a jerk. Nobody likes you, Agamemnon. Like, nobody likes you at all. Even Clytemnestra. And when you get back, she's gonna kill you. She's gonna kill you. And that's exactly what happens. But she is different than Penelope because she's not seen as the long suffering. I see her more as cold. She's cold and calculated and
Right.
smart. Okay.
So, who was the last one you wanted to talk about?
Anoni.
You kind of touched on her, and she was
Yes.
Paris's first
Right.
wife, right?
Right. So that's Anoni. She's a wood nymph, and he marries her, and they actually have a son, Corythus. And he leaves her and their son and goes to decides to live in the city of Troy, and he with Helen. And part of the chronology that developed was that Paris had to be much older. Paris was older than Achilles. Paris is like a whole big brother, like 18 years older than Achilles. He had to be.
Right.
And and so that kind of feeds into the story with Anoni, that he had a whole life with her and a son that he abandoned. Because if the story of the apple took place at Thetis and Peleus's wedding, Achilles hadn't even been born yet. So it has to be a long time after that before Achilles would then be going off to fight in the war. He has to get born and grow and train.
Right.
Right? So it's years later. So the promise that Aphrodite made to Paris was years before even Helen hadn't even been born yet. So so there's a whole, I go into that. I've got podcasts on it. So it was just something that I thought that didn't make any sense to me. Like, well, but there has to be, you know, and I mean, and Helen had to have her own life too. She had to get kidnapped first by Theseus and then take him, her brothers had to, you know, basically raise Athens to the ground and get her back, which is why the whole thing about Helen, the oath of Tyndareus being important, was that Helen had already been kidnapped. So if she never got kidnapped again, that there'd be a ready to go army to go get her back, because she'd already been kidnapped already. But this was already the experience. So there's this whole life. So he marries Anoni and he loves her until then, of course, I think he's under a love spell. That's how I view it. There's like this magical element. And I do keep the magical element in there between Helen and Paris. And it's almost like I love you. And then when Helen realizes that, wait a minute, my feelings for you aren't real. Like I've been created just to fulfill a promise. Like I left my husband and I abandoned my baby daughter for some magical bullshit. Like, damn it. And then she's all of a sudden they're fucking like, oh my God, like it's one of those, like I hate myself. And I don't like you, but oh my God, it's like an addiction, right? Like I want to quit, but I can't. That.
I love that Janell, let me just say that I love that your lens of these particular strands of mythology have lots of, sexual scandal and romantic intrigue, and there's a lot of drama, because you know what? There probably was a lot of drama.
Right?
Right? There were a lot of, slamming of hut doors or whatever.
Yeah, like there'd be a lot of, and
a lot of drunken debauchery and
lots of stuff. I'll tell you, I wrote this scene. I don't know if we can talk about this show, but I wrote a scene where after Clytemnestra had given birth to their son. So like there's years, like you see Clytemnestra and Agamemnon way before the war, right? Mm-hmm. And I wrote a scene where he's getting impatient about when he can have sex with her again. She's nursing the baby and he gets kind of turned on by it. So she puts the baby on the other side of the bed and then they proceed to like have some, hand-to-hand contact. And I get, and he kind of gets on there and he suckles a little bit. And then somebody said, this is so much porn and terrible. And I'm like, have you never had, like, every man out there, not every man, but I will guarantee you the percentage is high of men who are like, hey baby, let me just try that one time.
Let me try that, right?
Let me try that one time. And if women are honest, they would say like, yeah, I let them. I just get curious, but there have been readers who don't appreciate that,
right?
And I'm like, I feel like that's real, but for Clytemnestra's character, it fits because she's using her sexuality to control her world,
right? Well, and it's interesting because that is. You talk about giving them, these very modern day kind of human characteristics. And I think that that's true. I a long time ago, I read, and I wish I could remember who it was. but it was this author, and she talked about how the people that she worked with, because she did a lot of like mission work and volunteer work all over the world, and interviewed a lot of different kinds of people for this book that she was writing, about the common threads of humanity, regardless of where, what, how, why. And
Mhm.
she talked about how even when she talked to teenage aged uh, refugees who were, fleeing from war-torn countries and all of that, given the opportunity, they would talk about how they were concerned because their boyfriend was on the other boat with this other girl that they didn't like. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
it was really, I mean, I'm minimizing and paraphrasing, but it was really remarkable to read that these
Yes.
teenage aged kids they had the concerns of your everyday white American teenager. You know what I mean? So
There's a very human element, and I think that it's not unlike, um, when I think about, I don't, I think that the capacity to have the emotions that we do,
right,
it's not like jealousy is a modern thing, right? I think
right,
jealousy has been
right,
a part of the human fabric forever. That's
right,
part of what makes us human, right? The way that we have grief, the way that we have love. Just because love was not the first option to marry somebody doesn't mean that people didn't have those feelings or develop love or have any, things that we would associate with those feelings, right? So
right, right,
that's all part of being human on the male and female side, or
right,
on any kind of gender or fluid side. Like,
right,
to be human is to have a whole range of feelings that under certain circumstances will come out of you as a person. So what might make me jealous might not make the next person jealous,
right, right,
or what would cause me to have feelings of love might not be what causes somebody else to have love. But the fact that I have those feelings and that another person would, we can identify with that, even if what turns us on or what floats our boat or whatever is different. We recognize the feeling of it, because
right,
when we're brokenhearted or we have grief, it doesn't matter uh, when. I think that grief, we experience grief the same. I think in our
right,
modern world, we tend to, especially in the Western world, we tend to minimize grief specifically. We
right,
glorify love and we minimize grief. And in other countries around the world, like, grief, but, it's like, I'm just going to say Americans, like, you look at people like weeping on graves and, uh,
right.
wailing, and other countries have different ways to publicly show their grief. As Americans, we're like, well, gotta be all stoic, and we're just all at the
Right.
graveside.
That's what I was
Gotta be
just
like,
thinking
gotta suck
that
it
a
up,
lot of other
hold it
cultures
in.
really
Yeah,
that a
right,
lot of other cultures really celebrate death, and
right,
here in the West we're very
yeah,
gloomy about the whole affair, and
yeah,
it isn't like that everywhere. And I think, and that's also a cultural context too,
right,
right?
yeah.
Um,
I did when I buried my dad. They did uh, as the oldest child, I was presented the flag, and they did the
mhm,
whole shooting of the guns, and I almost couldn't even, it almost didn't even seem real, because
right,
you see it
right,
in movies, but when it
mhm,
was happening, like, oh my God, this is my life right now. This is,
right, right,
and you do feel like you feel the every time they would fire the guns. I mean, just like your whole chest, it was shocking.
right,
I don't even
right,
think I cried. I was just like, it was just, my chest was just, I was just being shocked every time the gun went off, and it was
right,
just
right.
like, I couldn't, almost like it made me kind of numb it in a weird way, like it was, ugh. But yeah, I could, but there was very much a sense of, like, I didn't feel like I could just like scream out and throw myself on the ground,
Right.
which
But
is
some
kind
cultures
of
do
what,
that.
Yeah,
because they're
exactly.
not
Which
as,
is kind of like what I wanted
listen,
to, which is kind of what I wanted to do. But that's my point is that you
we
have
are
those
so
feelings,
fucking puritanical here. It's ridiculous.
right?
That is a whole other show.
That
Um,
right, a whole other show. So back to Anoni, right? So we were
yeah,
um she gets left behind. She is definitely she's distraught.
yeah.
And there was a prophecy that was that in the end he was going to need uh her healing skills. She was a healer. So he was going to need her healing skills. And in the end, she gets jealous. She's jealous of Helen. And when Helen comes to her and says, Paris has been hit by these poisoned arrows, and then she says, no, like I'm not going to come and help him. And she then relents after, she feels guilty. Then she does go to help, and he's already passed.
Yeah.
So there's that. But Anoni is the forgotten wife. So she's just the one languishing in sorrow. And she eventually sends their son, their teenage son, to the city of Troy because he is
Hmm.
Paris's legitimate heir, conceived in a marriage. So Corthus goes to Troy, but under secrecy. Like Paris doesn't realize. Helen kind of keeps him secreted away, and well, that's a whole other Helen's a whole other ball of wax.
Yes,
Helen,
we should do another show and a whole show
yeah, we
about
should do one
Helen.
on Helen. But I
Because
feel like
The
Anoni,
Helen mythology plays into a lot of goddess stories as well,
yeah, and I think
conflating
yeah,
of,
and right, and I think that it's when I think I like archetypes. So we have light and shadow, and I see that there's gray, and I see that in individual. You know, we don't always shine in the light side of an archetype or the dark side, but sometimes we're in the gray. I
right,
think,
right,
right? So, and I think Helen is all over that map
right,
of
right,
light and dark and gray. And but Anoni was during the war. I think she represents even though she's a goddess, lower level goddess, but she represents most of the women who are just literally left behind,
right,
wondering, hoping, and maybe disbelieving, and just left to carry on day after day, taking care of whatever had to be taken care of. And think about um, most of the men would be gone.
right,
And over a period of 10 years plus, their younger sons are now teenagers, early 20s, because they
right.
weren't old enough to go off and fight. So you have a society of very young men and
They're
women
very young
being,
fatherless men.
yeah, very young fatherless men. And there might have been some grandpas around, right, that were too
Right,
old to
right,
go.
right,
But they would start dying off,
right,
because we're talking about 10 years. So by the time the guys would sail back, you're looking at a decade to 12, anywhere from like just average 12 years or so before they get back. That's a
yeah,
long time. So if you're 12, now you're 24. And that's
right,
where all the suitors come in. Like you got a lot of younger guys that are vying for
right, right,
Penelope's hand. It's not old farts. Like she's
right,
40
right,
years. Let's say she's about 42 and she's got a bunch of, you know, happy-go-lucky 20-year-old or 20, mid 20-year-old guys that are trying to get at her because they want the
right,
power. They've
right,
never been to war. They're untested. They're
right,
untested.
right, right,
They
right.
have like it's sort of maybe the way we look at some of the younger generation now, like, oh my God, you guys you have no idea what it was like to live without the internet.
Right, right. Which is us doing to them the same thing our parents did to us, right? We had to
Exactly.
have a
Like
paper route uphill both ways in the snow. All right,
barefooted,
right. Well,
one shoe, no
Janelle,
socks. Yeah. Every generation. So I feel like so you have a society of a lot of, basically young men and women who are now of marriageable age. Everybody's fatherless.
Right.
Think about that.
Yeah.
Most people are fatherless, and they don't even know if their dads are coming home. And then as the woman of the house, you can control that until what point, right?
Right.
Until your
Right.
son gets a beard, because now
Right.
your son is the boss.
Right.
Think about
Right.
that.
Right.
And that's reflected in the story of Penelope, because Odysseus said, look, hold it together, but if I don't come back before Telemachus grows a beard, you know, if I'm not back by then, then take another husband, because that means I'm probably dead. And she's like,
Right.
I don't want to hear that. And that was the whole weepy story. She's like, I'm not going to do that. And so what's happening in the Odyssey is we start to see that Telemachus is coming into his manhood. He's getting to that growing a beard part of his life.
Right.
But
Right.
that's also representing probably a lot of young men
Right. Right.
at that time. They are now like, I don't want to be under my mother's thumb.
Right.
And so Anoni to me represents that forgotten woman. Most people don't even know about Anoni. They don't even know
Right.
that Paris had another family that he left behind. Right. So
Yeah.
that was why I wanted to talk about her and bring her up, because think about what was going on in these societies, these villages,
Right.
these
Right.
cities
Setting the
without.
stage for all the drama. All
Yeah.
right, Janelle, I think we should wrap things up.
All right.
I ask all the guests the same three questions at the end of the show.
Okay. Yeah.
Uh, Tell me a fun fact about yourself that people would be surprised to discover.
Mm. That fun fact. Uh I guess I like tattoos.
Okay, you're right.
Most people don't expect.
I wouldn't guess that
Yeah,
by looking at you.
yeah. No, and yeah, I am planning like a full sleeve. So it is surprising to be like, what? I'm wearing like
Yes,
long sleeves. They don't see that, and then like I take a sweater off. I'm like, oh my gosh, she has all these tattoos.
right, right. I
Yeah.
get that. Okay, okay. Current favorite TV series or movie?
Ooh, Peaky Blinders.
Ah, that was really good. We were sad to see it end, but it's so
Oh,
good.
tell me. I just started season 3, and I was like, I think
Yep, yep,
Grace just got shot or something. I was like, what?
yeah.
I can't even watch this anymore. Oh,
It's so
I
good.
just,
Stick with it to
oh,
the end because it
yeah.
really couldn't end
Oh
any
my
other way.
God. I don't know
Okay.
how I missed it. Okay.
If your life were a movie, what would be the theme song on the soundtrack of your life?
Uh, oh, I'd have to say, oh my gosh, my brain just went blank. Um, Theme song, Take on Me by
I believe that's Take Me On.
Take Me On. Yeah, yeah, Take Me On. That one. You're right. That's it.
Okay. That
Because I'll
is
be gone in
a,
a day or two.
yep, yep. I
Yeah, it
gotcha.
is.
I gotcha.
Wow.
All right, Janelle. Well, I'm glad that we were finally able to schedule this.
Me
Um,
too.
and like I said, I'll be in touch and I'll
Okay.
send you copies.
All right.
And in the meantime, we'll keep following you on Instagram and Facebook and
All the places.
all those other things. So where we all are, right? That's what we were talking
Right?
about before the show
Yeah,
started. We have to be
right.
everywhere. We don't have a choice. So,
That's right.
all right. Well, thanks again. And I
Thank you
will
for having me.
talk to you soon.
Okay, bye.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching or listening. If you want more of The Girlfriend God, you can find The Girlfriend God and The Girlfriend God podcast on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. The Girlfriend